Hey there. Hey, I am brushing up on some color theory today in my watercolor tutorial, painting three spooky skulls. And this is an exercise I typically do in my figure drawing class or my basic intro to drawing course or my intro to watercolor course, just to, well, one, to practice our Loomis method. We can actually use the Loomis method to help construct these skulls, and these are human skulls. And we are also going to just kind of work with emphasis as to how that can be employed with what colors you use on each of the three. So I'm going to have a cool, overall cool dominant skull palette on one. We're going to have a neutral, and then we're going to have a warmer palette on the third. So this should be a fun little composition. It's going to be three skulls in one layout. It's going to be a horizontal composition, and each one of the skulls will be at a different angle. One's going to be a 3/4 to the right, 3/4 to the left, and a straight on view. So we're practicing all sorts of good things in this tutorial today. So let's get started, and we'll start with the sketch. The center skull is going to be the straight on view. The facing right skull will be on the left, and the facing left skull will be on the right. Is that right? So I'm going to work up a composition of these three skulls. I have different angles on them, and I'll try to make one of them. I'm also not only going to use color as a sense of emphasis, but I'm going to also use scale. And I'll probably make the center one. Let's make the center one the dominant one, and the other two are in support. So let's use our Loomis method, and we'll sketch these up.
So starting out with the center skull, I'm using the Loomis method, finding the shape of the head, chopping off the sides, and now starting to drop in the major features, the eye sockets, the nose, the sinus cavities. Just a quick sketch. It doesn't have to have a lot of detail. I am blocking in some of the shading, finding that front part of the face, the cheekbones. So I'll just walk my way through all three of these skulls, get them into a composition on my sheet of paper. This skull has the upper and lower jaw. And the teeth just have to kind of look like separate little irregular squares. I never worry too much about them being, unless it's a highly tight rendering, but they don't have to be that detailed. This sketch, it looks pretty good. It's not perfectly symmetrical. I think the right side might be a little narrower than the left side. All right, I'm going to get started on that right skull. And this is a skull without the lower jaw. No teeth, not as many teeth. I think there's a couple teeth there. So same drill. Find the circle. We worked in that side ellipse. Find the center line to the face. And that gives us the points where we can drop in all the other shapes. And again, I'm indicating essentially some of the shading. Just give me a little three-dimensional form there. And if I make a wrong mark, I'll come back over it, correct it, the correct mark. I'm not even worried about erasing. Drop in the shadows. Adding in some of the little cracks and things on the skull surface. Just bouncing around, adding in a little more of the modeling, the shading that will help me out when I start adding color. All right, jumping over to the left skull. Different angle, looking up. Upper jaw, lower jaw. Starting off finding that nose cavity. And then working over to the eye socket. This gives you a good indication of, when you're drawing an actual figure in a portrait, that mask that you kind of create to set your eye socket or your eyeballs into. This is the underlying structure where those eyes will go into. Dropping in those kind of irregular teeth shapes. Again, doing the blocking, finding the shade, the shadow, some of the finer details, the crunchiness down there on the lower jaw. Working around on that jawbone. And the shadows.
There we go. So we now have some nicely composed skulls that we can start watercoloring and creating the 3-palette color system or setup that I'm going to paint on this with watercolor. So let me get that stuff set up and we'll get started right now. All right, so I have everything set up and we're going to get started painting this. So let's take a look and see what we're going to do. I have the 3 skulls sketched up. This one I'm thinking is going to be a cool emphasis palette. The center one's going to be neutral and maybe be influenced with colors from either side. And this one's going to be a warmer palette. So that's my overall color plan for this composition, is to work with color emphasis across the composition and see if we can do it. To make the skulls pop, we're going to try to keep the backgrounds darker and have a little more intensity to them. So to get started with, we're going to start with our color blocking and hopefully get a good saturated color established right off the bat and see how it goes. All right, so let's get going. So what kind of a blue do I want? Do I want that? That's that nice dense blue there. Okay. So I'm going to be working with, this is a Strathmore 400. We're going to start out with a very rich, deep, saturated indigo blue with a little ultramarine mixed into it. And I'm going to transition it over to more of a neutral and then over here to a warmer tone.
All right, so I've mixed up some nice indigo blue. It's a nice rich blue, fairly thick. And I'm going to start my color blocking. Put the denser colors surrounding the skull. The skull is going to be warmer colors. I'm feathering out the lower portion as it gets down towards the ground. I'm going to mix up a neutral, a little bit of a burnt sienna and that indigo blue together, so it creates more of a gray. Still has a little warmth to it, but it's a neutral. It's a little more saturated than the lower portion, so I'll be feathering that out. And now I'm dropping in the burnt sienna. I think it had a little bit of yellow ochre mixed in with it. And now introducing some more of that neutral gray. That needs a little more saturation. The mixture's a little thin. I mixed up the wrong color right there. There we go. All right. So we are just kind of softening up some of the lower portions, adding a little color around, and that is now color blocked. So as that right side of the piece of paper is wet, I can bounce over to the left where it's dry. I'll start with the warm tones on the skull, blocking out the shapes, finding the overall forms through the shadows, and block in those warm tones, add a little definition, and start bringing that 3D form into reality. Feathering out some of those edges, and adding tone to the big lighter areas, very washed out colors. and just color blocking. Moving on to the center skull, doing the same thing, but this time with more neutrals, maybe a little cooler, but it's still kind of a bluish gray. Looking for the shadows, the shapes. Not a lot of detail, just big generalized shapes. And now cool colors on the far right. So everything's in opposite. So if the warm's on the right, the cool's on the skull. And vice versa. Same drill. Find the shapes. Block them in. Just knock down that white of the paper. Get the crunchy little bottom of the teeth. Put in a little coolness on the grounding, on the floor for some shadow.
All right, cool. All right, so that's essentially color blocking. I'm going to let this dry for a few minutes, and we'll come back in with stage 2, and we'll start refining some of the big shapes, getting a little more color saturation into it, and then we'll move into stage 3, maybe at the same time, maybe real quick stage 2. It shouldn't take much, but then come into stage 3 and do all of our saturation, structure, and our detail work. So hang on, let's get started in just a few minutes. All right, it's dried enough. I've got a couple wet spots yet that I will have to avoid, but I'm just going to go from left to right across the page, and I'm going to start intensifying the saturation in the darker areas and probably start drawing a little detail into the structure of the skulls. So from left to right, and we'll see how this goes.
So I'm starting stage 2 here with a color glaze, adding a little orange to that left skull. The photograph has a nice reddish orange on the interior of those cavities. But I'm also switching over. This is more of a stage 3 where I'm actually coming in and I'm starting to do a little bit of structure work just to find the bone structure in a little more of a detailed manner, and intensifying those shadows, finding the edges, doing a little more drawing with the brush and the darker colors. So it's really with the skulls in this one, we're kind of working backwards. We're kind of jumping from stage 3, doing that first, and then we'll come back over and start doing some color glazing and intensifying the saturation of the colors that is typically in stage 2. And right now I'm starting to do a little bit of that. And then jumping over, I'm doing the same thing with the center skull, doing that drawing with the brush, that dark blue and burnt sienna, burnt umber mixture, and I'm looking for the structure. Once I have the shapes outlined and or structured, I'm mixing in a little more tonal work, looking for shapes again, not so much outlines. And when I am outlining, it's an irregular mark, it's a broken mark. Yeah, now I'm starting to look for those shapes, blocking in shadows, adding a little more saturation to it. starting to create the sense of form. Now as I'm working on the center one, it's mostly a neutral gray, so it's a warm gray.
Hey, it's a different day again, and I didn't get it done in the first session. I had something come up, so I'm back at it on the next day. And picking up where I left off, going to be working with stage 2 and stage 3, kind of back and forth in that, but I'm going to be adding a little more structure onto the far right skull. I've got the left skull and the center skull kind of blocked out and structured up, and I'm going to start adding more glazing and more saturated colors and finding shapes. And I'll do the same thing on the right side as well. And then we'll move into the really denser paint, the thicker paint, and finding the detail, adding a little more structure to the teeth, and just the whole sense of skull qualities to the piece. So let's get back at it. Yeah, I have various issues here with what I sketched up originally. I've got this skull a little closer to the center skull than this one, but I think I was thinking that this side of this skull is going to be a lot darker ultimately, so it's going to visually look about even right in there. So that's what I was thinking. I was thinking. So let's go ahead and we'll get some mixtures of some of that neutral dark gray and a fairly thick mixture. My palette's dry and I have to wake up all my paint. And I'm going to be working with a pretty small brush to get started on this.
So just like the first and the second skull, I'm going to spend a little time defining, finding the shapes, finding the structure by just drawing, painting with that dark line. Once that's done, we can start blocking in and finding more saturation, denser grays, adding the colors into the white surfaces of the skull. And there is a lot of color, even on a white object. And once I have all the structure established and found on the underdrawing, painting in with that dark line, I can come in and I'm working in some colors for shapes and modeling across the surface. And as you can see, as I'm starting to glaze in the various colors onto the surfaces of the skulls, my color palette is quite different than what the original photograph has, so I'm not worried about what the colors are doing in particular in the photograph. They just kind of feed me information as to maybe the tonal range of those colors. I'm even introducing in some purples into that center. I'm even introducing some purples into that center skull. That's a color that I haven't used in any of the other areas of the composition yet. But purples are always very nice with neutrals and with the warm browns. It's just a very complementary color. Looks good. It looked so good, in fact. I used it over on the right skull, onto the ground, so it's really functioning and doing some nice things in the composition. Come back over to the indigo blues, really starting to intensify the shadows, the overall saturation throughout the whole of the piece. There's where I'm trying to darken up that gap, the side of the head. I'm losing edges and trying to get a little more visual space. between the right skull and the center skull. Trying to create a better sense of balance there. And that's what I'm doing. I'm just going to bounce through, just continue to glaze in more colors, more saturation. And we're pretty much in a stage 2 mode right now. So we did some of that initial structure work, which is typically stage 3. Now we've bounced over and come back to stage 2 for some of the saturation, finding and intensifying colors and shapes. I'm working with that really saturated orange, dropping it into various shades and tonal ranges, and we get that nice glow. I think that glow is what I like the most about the watercolor. It just has such a vibrant, iridescent quality to it. Alright, and now I'm moving into the detail stage where I've mixed up the really dark, thicker mixture of that indigo blue and burnt sienna, burnt umber. And now I'm coming in and I'm really starting to work on the detail, the definition, trying to get a sense of all of the little specks and marks and cracks and edges that I need to highlight and to add the final touches to. So this is the last stage of the painting. I'll just work around through the whole thing and find all those specifics and add that contrast in. That really makes the piece pop. So this is really a pretty standard subject matter that we work with the students up at the university. We have a shelf full of bones and models and heads and skulls. Most of these props are artificial. We have a couple. We actually have a medical school that we have some real skulls and rib cages and things like that, which is a little freaky to some of the students. And even with my observational drawing course, the non-figure course, we have a we have a local cemetery not too far away, and I'll take the students over early in the mornings, typically when my classes are, and we'll take a little hike over and we'll go over to the cemetery and draw headstones. Headstones are really good for planar analysis and learning perspective. So, and they really do make some pretty interesting some paintings and drawings. You can see me, I'm really coming in now, working in a lot of the detail. This portion of the painting really does take the longest. There's just so many little things to touch in just to get just right. So it's fun. So I'll work through the center one, I'll work over on the right one, and then we'll probably glaze in a few more of the complementary colors. And I need to remember, whenever I start a new session, I've got to lock my focus. I always lock it at the beginning of the recording sessions, and then as I'm working on it, I forget to lock it. So I keep seeing it coming in and out of focus. Sorry about that. But now I'm working over there on the right side of this on the paper, and I'm going to touch in all the little specks and details that makes that skull look believable. And I'm now also starting to bounce around, so I'm not working in one location. Get some more of that reddish purple. That gives the skull a nice warmth. Interacts nicely with that blue and that richer purple, adding a little more density to the blues over on that edge, that side of the the left skull. A little more saturation, density right there. Again, I'm trying to lose an edge right up in that spot. Intensify the shadows. And you've heard me say it before, when you want something to look lighter, you have to put something darker opposing it. It'll look great. So I'm just adding the last little touches, the last little bits of saturation, just the little final details, and I'm declaring this a completed piece. Probably add some little splatters in.
All right, so there's a quick Halloween 3 skulls, basically about 4 or 5 colors that I've worked with, a range of blues, oranges, burnt siennas. I have a purple in there, and then Payne's gray. So not a broad color palette whatsoever, but it's something really quick. It's a good exercise to practice what you can do with color on white objects, and that's one of the primary reasons this assignment exists, both on the dry media side with just charcoal, just learning how to control form, how to make a white object from drawing black, right? It's a hard thing to kind of wrap your head around, and it's a standard practice for our students up at the university. And then also when we move into the color section of that course, it's a really good color theory exercise as well. So this is a Halloween treat. And hey, if you got any value out of this video, please give me a like and a subscribe. Drop me a comment, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.